ยืนนอนแล้วเนี่ย
Window to window.
Just window to me.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Macdonald-Laurier webinar. Where do we go from here in pursuit, essentially, of Indigenous prosperity? My name is Ken Coates. I'm a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, specializing in Aboriginal and Northern Canadian issues. I'm delighted to have you with us today and delighted to introduce you to a fabulous panel. Everybody knows that the oil and gas industry is facing challenging times. The COVID pandemic has caused difficulties, so has the international turmoil in the global marketplace. But what's also interesting is that for the last 10 or 15 years, Indigenous communities have made an extraordinary effort to become involved in the oil and gas sector and have enjoyed considerable success, both in employment and business opportunities, but also more recently in equity investment and leading the charge for some of the largest projects in the country. Something TransMoutain Pipeline, we know that there's some Indigenous people who are opposed to it, and that we respect and honor their concerns. But at the same time, a lot of Indigenous folks and First Nations people in British Columbia and Alberta are very much in favor. We know that the good folks at Haisla First Nation in Northwest British Columbia have been strong supporters of LNG Canada and the Coastal GasLink Pipeline project, as have almost all the First Nations across northern BC. So the question we're asking today, we know how we got here. We talked about this in a webinar just a short while ago. We know how we got here. The question is now where do we go from here? And we've assembled a wonderful panel for you today. Three individuals who have a deep experience in different aspects of the oil and gas sector. And we welcome their comments and your opportunities to ask them questions. So the format is going to be each of our three panelists will be given about 5 minutes to make opening remarks. After that time, I will, as the moderator, have a series of questions that we want to sort of use to lay the framework and go beyond the observations that they've made. After that, we've been collecting questions from audience participants, and we'll continue to collect those questions as we go along. And we open the opportunity for you to send your questions in, and we can try to fit them in. We have an hour and a half, and we're going to use that time as best we can. So our three panelists today. Mark Pulaski is the Director of Economic Policy and Initiatives for the First Nations Major Project Coalition, and he's a member of the Cooks Ferry First Nation, a very well-respected analyst of economic development in British Columbia and Canada as a whole. Crystal Smith, who's the very impressive Chief Counselor of the Haisla National Council, and one of the leading proponents for LNG Canada, but also a very proud and very successful leader of her community in a period of cultural revival and economic renaissance. It was great to see. Delbert Wapas has been attracting a lot of attention lately for his very articulate sort of defense of what's going on in terms of oil and gas in Western Canada. He is the founder of Project Reconciliation. He's a former chief of the Thunderchild First Nation. So we'll get ready for a very interesting and important debate and discussion. And I'm going to turn it over to Mark Pulaski first and ask him for his first observations.
Good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here. As you heard, my name is Mark Pulaski. My traditional name is Thatcha, and I'm a member of the Kitamat First Nation. And I'm here representing the Major Projects Coalition. The First Nations Major Projects Coalition is a group of about 65 First Nations across the country who are interested in becoming equity owners in infrastructure projects like pipelines, high-speed transmission lines, a rail line that's being proposed in northern British Columbia. And what we are starting to see now among First Nations is that we realize that these developments are going to happen. They're going to happen on our territories. We want to say and how they're going to happen, and we want to be able to benefit from the projects. In the past, consultation has been lacking, let's say, in terms of how it provides a revenue stream or benefits to communities. We want to be part of that infrastructure. And the big change that's happened over the past 20 years is First Nations are now looking to provide capital as investment into these projects where we become shareholders and equity holders and enjoy the revenue streams. So we're going to talk heavily about that today around oil and gas, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. One last point is I am also the chair of the Pacific Trails Pipeline Coalition, FNLP, which is 16 First Nations across the north of British Columbia on the Kitamat LNG project. So there's a of how multiple First Nations come together in linear projects and how we see this as a future going forward for the country's building out of infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. You've identified a series of issues and topics and perspectives we're going to come back to as we sort of go along and look at the strategies for engagement. And I think not very many people know about the collective efforts that are being made, which is really very important. Crystal, Chief Councillor of the Haisla First Nation.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for having me on today's panel. As mentioned, my name is Crystal Smith. I am the elected Chief Councillor of the Haisla Nation. I also represent the First Nations LNG Alliance as the chair, and I also sit on the First Nations Limited Partnership with Mark. So definitely a lot of conversation in my work around the participation and inclusion of First Nations communities here in Northern British Columbia when it comes to participation within the LNG sector here, whether it's a pipeline or directly here in Kitamat. So in terms of the success of LNG Canada, it is the largest private investment decision, and it's a huge win in terms of our participation and the success of the final investment decision being made here in Kitamat. We definitely worked a long time to get to this point, a lot of approximately 10 years to see the success here in Kitamat, and are definitely working towards making that participation and all of the benefits come to realization here for our community, but also for Northern British Columbia. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Crystal. We'll turn now to Delbert Wapas, the founder of Project Reconciliation. Delbert, over to you.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Ken. For this for organizing this, giving us the opportunity to share what we're about and what we need to do, I guess, as Indigenous peoples. PRI is we're not a pipeline company. We are an Indigenous-led company who's seeking to buy a majority stake in the TMX. And what we represent is a building nation-to-nation relationships and nation-to-nation commerce. We had trade amongst our nations. We had a system of commerce. We had a nomadic way of life that we could survive and protect our environment. We moved from place to place rather than overhunting or overfishing or taking too much medicinal plants and so on and so forth. We're also about addressing income inequality. We have developed an economic framework with the intention that every First Nation Western Canada can participate and benefit to some degree. I've witnessed as a chief, working with other nations at the at AFN or at other chiefs gatherings where some First Nations are progressing well and other First Nations have fell behind. No fault of their own. This does not mean that all nations are treated equally, because obviously some are more affected than others by specific projects, whatever they may be in your backyards, and as a result, they should benefit from. Over time, as we develop investments in more projects, all First Nations will benefit more and more, and the income inequality will narrow not only between Indigenous Canada, but non-Indigenous Canada, and even amongst ourselves as First Nations. We cannot create a framework that does not allow a path to prosperity for every First Nation, because we did not have a choice of where we settled, and many did not win the geographic location. So those that are close to cities, all the power to them, and to take every advantage of that. Those of us that live remotely, 2, 3, 15, 16 hours away from urban center, we have to be as strategic and plan for that. The other thing we represent is economic reconciliation within Canada. The Indian Act has not allowed First Nations to prosper in Canada. Its economy at a scale due to constraints of the economic model put in place by government that was barely effective when treaty was signed, never mind in 2020. So when we hear the Prime Minister say that we're including First Nations, Indigenous people to have ownership in a pipeline, we were there. Canada has been ineffective in creating meaningful Indigenous business or investment opportunities that can be sustained for the long term. So we need to participate. We need to take our rightful place and to be invited and to take those opportunities. And the only way we can do that is by getting involved in such things as the opportunity of buying an Indigenous stake, majority stake within TMX. Looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Delbert. The three of you have, in very different and very important ways, provided really invaluable sort of comments and insight into the different models that are available. And many of these will not be well understood, I think, by the people who are listening today. Some of you will be involved with this, but we're actually seeing it isn't just a question of sort of standard involvement, starting up a oil and gas supply company, getting a job with one of the oil companies, or making a small equity investment. We're actually talking about some very creative measures that First Nations are using to build a prosperous future within this sector. So I've got a series of questions that I've got for the members, panelists who are here today, and we'll go through them. I'm going to ask directly questions to each of our speakers, and if others want to sort of jump up and just give me a wave, and I'll include you in the conversation as well. So the first one goes to Crystal, and I've really been enormously impressed with what the Haisla have done in terms of responding to the opportunities, but also the challenges of LNG Canada. Anybody who thinks that the First Nations just go along with what the companies want or what the companies say, I can assure you that the company executives will tell you that's not true. That in fact they push back very creatively, very responsively. So to Crystal, the question is this: when you consider the long-term interests of Indigenous peoples, what's the best place for Indigenous communities in the oil and gas sector? How do you prepare yourself to participate fully in the economic opportunities of oil and gas?
I think it's what we're seeing here in Northern British Columbia and also on the TMX is going beyond the status quo of being just generally participating along with the I guess the development stages, what it alludes to of the training, participating in the jobs and services, to outright ownership and the development of these projects. In terms of moving beyond just, each of us, we have a vision for our people. And when it comes to being participant to projects, we vision the quality of life improvement for our members. In terms of the projects that have been, we've been fortunate enough to live around around the Douglas Channel, which provides a lot of opportunity for project development here. When it comes to our environment and what is acceptable when it comes to what type of products are proposed for our area, it's I'm sorry, I'm hearing an echo in the background, so it's a bit distracting. My apologies. So when it comes to the product in terms of that participation portion, it's actually working right alongside of what is acceptable, not only to the leadership of the community, whether that be hereditary or elected. I think it's the inclusion of membership and where they see and envision our communities and what they want for not only for our generations today, but for future generations when it comes to project development. I think for success for everybody that's involved is aligning all of our goals and objectives and actively seeking solutions to issues that will essentially get that buy-in from the entire community. Thanks.
Thanks, Crystal. You actually remind us, I think, of a really important event, a part of this process. And I think actually, in my view, it's a bit of a kind of fundamental difference between Indigenous and non-Indigenous perspectives on some of these projects. That I think the non-Indigenous perspective, including governments, has been focused on the economic returns and who makes money and how much money is made. And every time I've spoken to you and every time we've heard you speak, which fortunately has been many times, you're always talking about the fact that essentially oil and gas development is a tool. It's actually it's not the end, it's not the goal. It's a tool you're going to use to get where you want to go. And when I hear you talking about this, where you want to go is actually to cultural renewal, to strong and healthy communities, to people who are employed, to people who have a sense of ownership of their future. And you do a wonderful job of articulating that point of view. So thank you very much. I very much appreciate that. Delbert, I have a question for you. And I've been again watching you in this process of project reconciliation, which I remember when it first came out, sort of flabbergasted everybody. Remember hearing almost the first couple of days after they announced this, and commentators across the country were saying, well, this is a silly idea. Why do Indigenous people think they can actually do something like buy TransMoutain Pipeline? It was a very, very interesting question. So Delbert, my question to you, at present, what barriers and challenges stand in the way of Indigenous peoples as they try to get a better and stronger place in the oil and gas sector? What's preventing you from going forward, not just with project reconciliation, but with a stronger and longer record of participation?
Excellent question, Ken, and let me do my best in trying to answer that or bring some focus to it. Our First Nations have the opportunity to collectively participate in large infrastructure projects, be it green, real estate, or whatever they look like. But we have to be capitalized to maximize our bargaining ability with industry and government. And we feel if we have the model correct and First Nations can move at the speed of business without relying on outside sources of funding, we can realize these opportunities and begin managing wealth as opposed to continuously managing poverty. And we've been asked, the Canadians are being asked to weigh in on social responsibilities against the economy, but they are inseparable. A strong economy depends on collective and well-being. There is no bright future for Canada that fails to address Indigenous exclusion and inequality. So when we
live streaming,
I think you're okay, Delbert.
okay.
Brett,
So
can you confirm?
Yes, please go ahead.
So going back to your question about, at present, what barriers and challenges stand in the way of Indigenous peoples as they secure a better and stronger place in the sector, Ken, we need to be taken more seriously. We need real commitments in terms of investment and procurement to help us build capacity and get us closer to independence and self-determination. We cannot and should not have to shoulder these challenges alone. We need real allies and action to form true partnerships rather than just trying to secure a better place in the sector. We need to dismantle structural exclusion. This means that Indigenous people need to be at the table as true partners with decision-making influence. Anything less risk leaving these issues and barriers intact. So again, it can't be a token opportunity. It has to be real, has to be meaningful, and we have to be, find a path into the boardroom so we can affect change and be part of positive change.
That's excellent, Delbert. When I listen to you talk about these things, I hear a combination of sort of hope and frustration. I'm not sure if I've captured it properly. The frustration and the fact that you're having to raise these issues yet again. As a chief, you did this very well in Saskatchewan and Western Canada. Why is the country so slow to allow economic opportunity to develop and to allow First Nations to have an appropriate place in the economy? The hope that I hear is that when you get a major project emerging, something like TransMoutain, and you see these sort of tipping points in terms of the economy, where the economy is shifting from one area to another area, it does create an opportunity for change, doesn't it? Where
Yes.
if we get this right, we actually could see a very different world evolve.
Exactly. And we have to, do it right. We can't take the divide and conquer approach, even amongst ourselves as Indigenous peoples, where we all have to be in it together. We all have to make sure that we're fair to one another, and we all have to understand the position of where we're coming from.
Yeah. I'll make one last quick observation that when I grew up in the Yukon, the idea of a First Nations person being wealthy was kind of unheard of. People weren't even used to the concept of an Aboriginal person being wealthy and having good economic opportunities. When I look at Western Canada now, I remember going to a meeting one time in Fort McMurray, and Chief Jim Boucher of the Fort McKay First Nation said, he was speaking to a group of 400 people, and he said, "I want to introduce you to 12 people." I think the number was 12, but don't quote me on that. And he introduced them one by one, and he said, "What do these people have in common? They're all millionaires." They had all got involved in the economy in the oil and gas sector, and some owned a helicopter company and one owned a welding company, and they'd all been very, very successful. And what's really interesting was for the non-Indigenous people there who were in the oil and gas sector, they actually weren't surprised, but they were pleased that, in fact, Indigenous wealth was wealth for everybody. It wasn't one of these things where it was, that somehow one group was succeeding and the others not. Thank you very much, Delbert. I appreciate that very much. Mark, I have a question for you. What does the government of Canada need to do? Macdonald-Laurier is a public policy institute, and we focus a lot on that. What does the government of Canada need to do in terms of its policies and programs to solidify Indigenous engagement in the oil and gas sector? Be really interested in your thoughts.
Thank you, Ken. I'll give two and a half suggestions here. One of the biggest challenges for First Nations becoming involved in this space is access to capital. Capital can be accessed through different government programs, but most of the government programs either have such long timelines to them or requirements that it's not really effective for First Nations. It's also the projects that are coming along now, like the pipeline projects and transmission lines, they're in well over 100 million, many cases up into 5 billion in terms of pipelines. And that sort of capital can only come from the private market. So there would be need for government federally to have some way or encourage access to capital of that size. There is a model in the country in Ontario. There's a provincial program called the Indigenous Sovereign Loan Guarantee Program, which has been very successful. First Nations have accessed that to get involved in transmission lines. It allows First Nations, and it's not a grant, it allows First Nations to access capital backstopped by the creditworthiness of the government, and it lowers the cost down to something that's more reasonable. One example of this in northern British Columbia would have been useful quite some time ago is when the first pipelines came across. There have been clauses in those negotiations for the First Nations to buy equity or acquire equity, but nobody could get cost of capital below 26, 28, 29%. Pipelines have a regulated return, usually around 12, maybe 13, sometimes lower. It doesn't work. A loan program would work there. The second thing would be encouragement of some sort of collective vehicle for First Nations to work together in managing the wealth that flows from these projects. Something like an Indigenous Sovereign Loan Guarantee, Indigenous Sovereign Wealth Fund Act or vehicle that allows First Nations to take the money that's come into these projects and invest it in ways that would help not only their community, but possibly other First Nations to make that pot of money grow. The federal government has, for Indigenous people, a policy called own source revenue. So if revenue is raised by First Nations, many times you'll have another department of the government come along and claw back that money through other initiatives through Indigenous Services Canada or another part of the government. Quick story, my community has 8 bands, First Nations, came together to sign a impact benefit agreement with Canada's largest copper mine in our territory. And within 6 months of the settlement being happened, we had the federal government attempt to claw back that money through reductions in transfer payments, saying that, well, we could use that money to pay for essential government services. It defeats the purpose of a First Nation getting involved with private sector if that's the case. And it actually goes against the private sector. It goes against the concept of First Nations participating in the economy. So there's 2 items there. 1, sovereign loan guarantee program to lower cost capital. 2nd, some sort of vehicle to encourage the management of these pools of income to better First Nations and their neighbors.
What I like very much, Mark, thank you very much for that. What I really like about the comments that you're making, and it runs a bit counter to sort of how some people see First Nations approaching the oil and gas sector, is the business case foundation. You're talking here about Indigenous people being involved in businesses, and the interventions you're asking for government are to overcome historical inequities. You can't use your land as collateral because of the Indian Act. So therefore, there are severe constraints on what a non-Indigenous person would be able to do in the same sort of circumstance. And that's a legacy of an Indian Act that's 1876. It's well over 150 years old, right? So that's what you're asking for, is a chance to participate essentially as equals. And I see 2 other things, Mark, and I just want to test these with you to see if I have it right. That number 1 is you need speed, that the private sector works very fast and government doesn't. And to the degree that First Nations are reliant on traditional government systems, it won't work because you have to make a decision at the speed of business, basically. And the other one, and I appreciate your comments on this, and it'll lead, I think, into Crystal's my next question to Crystal, is that the First Nations are almost all really small. If you look at Delbert and Thunderchild, we're not talking about a community that has 35,000 people. We're talking about very small populations, and even if you organize them by culture group or by treaty group or whatever else, Treaty 6 is a large area, but again, it's not 150,000 people. It's probably, what would it be, Delbert, 10, 15,000 people in total. And so, am I right in this regard? Is it speed and size that these are 2 of the major issues that First Nations have to address?
You're talking about internal governance, how First Nations need to organize themselves to participate in a commercial venture, in a linear project in particular, right? Because those cross multiple, not just bands, but they call multiple linguistic First Nations from coast to coast, or at least from province to province. That is an issue, although First Nations, as you've seen with the negotiations right now on the gas pipelines in northern British Columbia, we've seen it in northern Ontario, or organizing around, say, Watakaneeya Power, where there's 26 First Nations coming together. First Nations, we don't exist in a vacuum. We know these are challenges for our own organizations, and we are addressing them through organizations like the Major Projects Coalition, around the First Nations infrastructure initiatives. They're being addressed, and First Nations are aware of that. And we are aware that our size at times is an issue in terms of getting attention. That's why there's groups like Delbert's coming together, trying to get a critical mass and match that to the speed of commercial opportunities. It takes time, but it is happening. And if you look back, you said at the time you were growing up in the Yukon, this would have been unheard of at that time. It's happening now, and it's happening faster and faster.
What an exciting and important development. Crystal, just over to you for the last of our moderated questions. Then I'm going to turn to a series of questions from the audience. And just so you know, we're almost at 8:30, so we're half an hour into a 90-minute kind of conversation, so you have a sense of our collective time sort of going forward. Crystal, when you look at it from a community perspective, when you invited me up to come to one of a really interesting session about a year and a half ago, that was all of the First Nations, the Haisla First Nation, but also the surrounding First Nations, and all of the oil and gas companies and service companies, supply companies, government agencies, to come together and talk about sort of how to plan for the future. And the thing that really impressed me, among many things, was the solidarity of your community. That it wasn't just the chief and councillor chief councillor and the other councillors who were in favor of these initiatives, that you had business people, community members, young people who were there talking about the future that they saw. So you're a pretty good example of what I'm talking about here. So what are the best strategies for Indigenous communities and for Indigenous organizations and governments as they try to expand their presence in the oil and gas sector?
Thank you for those remarkable comments. We definitely worked very hard and did crossed all our T's, dotted all our I's in terms of that community success and wanting a better future for our members. So in terms of the strategies that we used to offer success to the LNG industry was informing ourselves as leaders. We took the time to learn about and weigh the pros and cons around environmental issues. Not only the issues, but taking time to focus on solutions that came along with those. We informed our council and our staff at a broader range and focused heavily on informing our community so that we could collectively make these decisions in that sense. We took a glimpse at other First Nations communities, whether it be in BC or in Alberta, to see how they were benefiting from the economy within their territories, and also to see what they have done and been successful in doing. There's lots of nations that have made mistakes and learned a lot from them. And we need to build that strength between each of our communities and take advantage of what other communities know. And then getting to the point of deciding if the project is worth supporting. Our community needs to see the benefits. They need to feel the benefits. And then definitely getting actively involved with the project in the sense of attending meetings with both government and the proponent. And then getting ahead of the game in terms of the training aspect. Like I said, our vision is to improve the quality of the lives of our people today and for future generations. So that involved a lot of planning in terms of developing independent members through training, education, and later employment. And that's essentially what we're seeing, that I'm very fortunate to say that I'm seeing today in our community, is our members breaking down the barriers that First Nations experience when accessing training and employment. We have, I have, for an example, a young mother who, through my first job with school district in our territory, I witnessed her grow up in our community, and she definitely didn't have it easy. We struggle with addictions, and today through very, very hard work of our staff, working with one of our partners, developed a program that she accessed. She had been upgrading at the time, and the development of this program happened. And she was one of 8 within the program. She was the only female, and she's a young single mother. And I'm so happy to say today that she has her first job. It's a meaningful job that she's starting out at an entry-level position and will be working her way up within the organization. And it has made a huge, huge difference, not only for her and raising her young daughter, but now she's a role model. I after having a discussion last week in a similar setting like today, I reached out to her on Facebook and had to tell her how inspiring she is. I watch her on social media, and the strength that she's been able to show and grasp an opportunity and work to remove barriers for herself so that she can provide for her daughter is absolutely inspiring. And when I get tired and stressed, it absolutely helps to see our people succeed. Not only is this one great example of why we do and want to participate within the sector. I sit on a council table. I've never seen so many mortgages come across our table for home ownership in our community. And they're all within the age of 20 to 30 years old. And it is absolutely, I don't even have a word for it. It makes me so emotional that they're not dependent on us to provide solutions. Our people are finding solutions for themselves and putting roofs over their heads, vehicles in their driveways, and traveling the world. It is absolutely great to see First Nations people succeed, and definitely would want to share that type of wealth and see other Indigenous communities thrive. Thank you.
Crystal, thank you so much for not just your own inspiring story, which is part of this larger inspiring story, but for sharing the experience of that young woman. And it's a huge reminder for us that when we look at this from outside, from a Canada-wide perspective, we see LNG Canada, we see the Haisla First Nation working in partnership and developing a big project. What you've reminded us of is that inside that one big project, there are thousands of small lives. I don't mean small lives, but individual lives. And Delbert, it must be the same for you when you think of Project Reconciliation. Here you've got somebody who's leading an attempt for First Nations to buy a pipeline in whole or in part. But underneath that are a whole bunch of First Nations who want to do exactly what you've described, which is help young people get a start, get them launched into their lives, into a job and into a home and into a sort of a life of prosperity. So that was really, really wonderful. Thank you very much, Crystal. Delbert, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, I'd like to add to that, and that is a very powerful story, Crystal. Thank you very much for that. And we have in Thunderchild, I've seen that exactly what you're talking about. I can echo in Thunderchild as well. Seeing as a leader, as a person who advocates for something better, for a better quality of life for our people. I go back to our relationship with Husky Energy and working with peoples like Dolan, Janet Annesley, Robert Peabody, the president CEO, and Chris Geeky and others, and the work that they've done, the positive work that they've done in this positive relationship has created the opportunity and has given a ray of hope to our people to see that there is something better if we apply ourselves. It meant getting up at 4:30 in the morning, being on a bus at 5:30 or 5 o'clock, and coming back late. But when they got that paycheck and they were able to take their kids out for a family meal, or they were able to furnish their place, it was something that was very powerful, and you can only feel it, and you can hear it when they're talking. And for once, when we had our band General Assembly, we had a community that was talking about, the power of economic development and relationship building. So thank you very much for that, Crystal.
Well, and thank you too very much for sharing that, Delbert. That's a really important sort of set of observations that I think are really, really critical. And I guess what I'd sort of add to that, and I'm glad you mentioned this, you specifically mentioned a series of people by name and talked about the role that even a chief executive officer of Husky Oil, individual staff people had played, that actually reconciliation is not just about Indigenous people taking control of their destiny and their future and making choices and whatever. But in order for this to succeed, you actually need partners. You need collaborators, and you need companies, but also individuals within those companies and within government who see themselves as part of the solution, who actually figure out what's going on in your communities and become supportive of that initiative. And so I think it's really important for us to remember the contributions of those kinds of people. So thank you very much for sharing that. Appreciate it a lot. So Mark, I've got a testing question for you. It fits very much with your comments before about the nature and the foundation of economic development. Mark, one of our listeners, basically said this: Thomas Flanagan, in his Donner Prize-nominated work, The Wealth of First Nations, talks extensively about the importance of improving property rights on reserves as part of economic development. Based on your personal experience and the cases with which you're familiar, what can you tell us about the state of property rights on reserves and where Indigenous people need to go with those property rights as part of an economic development strategy?
Okay, thank you. Just as a background for people who don't know, First Nations in this country, because of the way it was set up on the Indian Act, is that we don't own the lands, or we don't own our reserves technically. They're held by the federal government. They're held by Her Majesty in trust for the use of Indians. So that's what Ken referred to earlier. We can't go to the bank and leverage our property. We can't leverage our assets because technically they're all Crown assets. So the problem comes then is that, say a project comes along like a pipeline and we want to borrow money like anybody else would on their property. We can't do that. We have to get a ministerial guarantee or we have to get the federal government to approve it. So the question refers to the fact about should that change? In the United States, there have been attempts to change Indian, Native American land ownership, but that's caused some problems as well. It's turned into a situation where tribes in the states have lost control of their land base. And for us as Aboriginal people, the land is life. The land is everything. So it's not as easy just to say, oh, we're going to leverage our traditions and our heritage for a quarterly return on some infrastructure project. So it's not as simple as simply turning the land into fee simple and letting Aboriginal people go to it. We do look at, and again, this is not all First Nations, my First Nations, many of the First Nations that I interact with see the communal ownership of land as very important. We do have some vehicles in our different First Nations, like certificates of possession, allow people to actually use land for different purposes, but it's not as simple as just making things fee simple. What would be better, I should say that I would prefer to see, my First Nation example, Christian and Delbert would talk about their own situations, is to provide some sort of communal pool of communal access to capital in a way that might be anchored on land, but the land has to be protected. It's not a simple thing of turning it to fee simple. And it's a complicated question at that point. I'm not avoiding the question. What I'm trying to say is that not everybody wants to go fee simple, because if we lose our land base, we as identity as Indigenous people is gone. We're just then swept into the streams of capitalism unfettered. And that's just not where First Nations want to go. Tom Flanagan has a point around that. Land has been the anchor point for economic development for people around the world. But from our worldview, it's also our identity, our health, who we stand as Indigenous people separate from other Indigenous people and colonial peoples. So my answer to that is access to capital pools anchored on a communal foundation would be a better way to go.
Thanks very much, Mark. And I wonder, Crystal, if you have a few comments. It's interesting in contrast to what Mark just said, and perhaps it's part of what Mark just said. And in response to the question, you said one of your great joys was actually seeing young people come forward and actually asking for signing mortgage agreements, basically, I think, with the Haisla First Nation, if I'm not mistaken. How do you handle that in your community?
I'm sorry, what was the question, the original question?
Well, the question was, how do you handle the access to actually mortgage money? How does your community help for young people sort of buy houses?
Well, it's an on-reserve program that we have partnered with RBC to allow that to allow that onto our reserve. Yeah.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Thank you. Delbert, Lisa asked this question of you, one of our listeners. I just remind the listeners that those of you who are on YouTube chat, make sure if you have any questions, just send them in, and we'll see if we can put them in our sequence and get a chance to answer them. We won't probably get to all of the questions since there are many. But please do ask your questions. Appreciate that much. Delbert, the question for you, Lisa says this: is this a topic that Canadian non-Indigenous high school students should be educated on? And if so, what is an effective approach so they can understand the importance of Indigenous involvement in the economy?
Yeah, no, excellent question. But before I go to that question, I just want to echo what Mark talked about when he gave his answer or his perspective to your earlier question that he just finished articulating to all of us. And that's exactly what Project Reconciliation is all about regarding the Sovereign Wealth Fund is, bringing 340 nations together and to be able to be positioned to realize those types of opportunities, so we can, be in control rather than being controlled, in a very equal footing, and to basically buy our way into boardrooms so we can, affect change in a positive way or to be part of that positive change. So thank you very much for that, Mark. Back to the question, that Lisa is raising. I think it's very important that we need everyone to understand the history and the relationship, between First Nations, Indigenous peoples, and non-Indigenous peoples. I think we need to start there so we can understand, the importance of Aboriginal title, Aboriginal right, the importance of treaty right, and how that triggers, and so people will understand. From our perspective, here in Saskatchewan, as an example, they'll realize that we're all treaty people. That it's not only First Nations who have signed treaty, but we are all treaty people. And what responsibilities do you have that go with that? So you have Brad Wall, back when he was premier, that made it mandatory that teaching treaties in a classroom. That will provide that perspective and educate our kids so they won't grow up, living 5 minutes from a reserve and never going to it. Or, going to Turtleford and walking by each other at town of Turtleford and not saying hi to each other. And I guess the other thing is that we need to understand the importance of economic participation of the Indigenous population in Canada. What will happen? We're seeing right now, the limited opportunity that we have, in participating economically because of our positions, our realities. But we also see the hint of the positiveness when those First Nations that have the ability have moved themselves into a position where they can invest and get involved in, how much employment and opportunity and stimulus that they provided to Canada as a whole, let alone their First Nations community. So I think there's a lot of education, there's a lot of understanding, and it can only be positive to understand each other.
Thanks, Delbert. Wonderful comments, just terrific. And I'm struck by the fact that if you look across the country, you see so many examples of exactly what you're talking about. If you look in the Maritimes, for example, the Donald Marshall decision recognized Aboriginal treaty rights to fish for commercial purposes. And what you've seen is an economic renaissance in Indigenous communities. They own boats, they operate fish plants, they're making money in exactly the kind of commercial environment that Mark has been talking about. This is not about charity, it's not about handouts, it's about Indigenous people using their rights and converting them into opportunities. And I grew up in the Yukon, and when you look at what's happens up there, you get some really remarkable transformations in communities that back in the 1960s were completely frozen out of the natural resource economy, and that now have very important roles. The Trunduk First Nation, which is centered around the city of Dawson, around Dawson City, is very heavily involved with mining companies and resource companies. So we don't have to be surprised about this anymore, do we? We know what actually happens. That's really excellent. And it actually leads very directly to a question for Crystal. And so thank you very much, Delbert. Crystal, Grace asked this question of, can we get an update on the progress of the Kitamat LNG terminal and the role of the Haisla in that project? So you're on the national stage, young lady. People know about what you folks have done, and you're getting a lot of attention. But let's dig down a little bit and tell us what's actually happening in the community. That'd be very excellent.
So the Kitamat LNG projects, for most of you that follow the sector, know that Chevron is selling a portion of their share. In regards to on the ground, in our involvement with that project, we own a reserve that the project is being built on. So it is across the Douglas Channel. We, like other projects, we have our impact benefit agreements around contracting and participation within that project. As they're doing their work to sell the project, we're not seeing too much activity within Kitamat in regards to that specific project, unfortunately.
What's the situation with the Coastal GasLink? Is there work with that project in your region?
There is a lot of work. There's a lot of work with Coastal GasLink. We're seeing the changes. I was fortunate enough amidst all of this COVID that we're all experiencing. I was lucky enough to go and witness some of the first wells being done on the pipe that was going to be laid not too long after they were welded together. So there is a lot of activity in regards to the Coastal GasLink project and along with the LNG Canada project. So a lot of opportunity for employment, a lot of opportunity for contracting. It is definitely a great atmosphere and time here in Kitamat to see all the opportunity that's here for our people and for other First Nations across northern British Columbia. I think it's hugely important that we maximize the opportunity that we have in front of us with this project that has announced their and under construction, to share that opportunity and wealth with our neighboring First Nations. So in any opportunity that I get, it is definitely a conversation that is amazing to have with other leadership when it comes to talking about that collaboration of how we as First Nations communities work together for the betterment of our members. So within this LNG Canada project and Coastal GasLink, I've been able to connect with our neighboring nations such as Kikatla, Kitslis, Kitsum-Kalem, and the Nishka, to talk about those specific opportunities and how we can work together in order to improve the quality of the lives of all of our people.
And the change is dramatic. The last time I was in Kitamat and Terrace, I had two conversations, both in the restaurants with casual people who were just talking to, and they were all talking about the Coastal GasLink and talking about LNG Canada. And one of the things that really struck me was how the Haisla had become star players. It wasn't this question of, sort of, oh, they're getting in the way or they're interfering or they're taking too much of the profit. What was interesting was the comment from the non-Aboriginal people was essentially the fact that without the Haisla, these projects wouldn't go ahead. And that it was the Haisla participation that brought prosperity to everybody. And I'm sure, I know you know that. I know people tell you that on a regular basis. And I think it's important for folks to understand that when you get Indigenous empowerment, you actually get the prosperity of the region as a whole expands. And this is not about a zero-sum game where all the money flows to Indigenous people or all the money flows out of the territory. That one of the things we know across Canada is that when Indigenous peoples are involved in natural resource development, the return to the local region actually accelerates. You get a better local impact with Indigenous participation than if you tried to do a project without that participation. So thank you very much, Crystal. And just so I know you know this already, that lots of people are watching. Thanks very much for Grace's question, but lots of people are watching what you're doing and are really impressed with the fact that this is not about just Indigenous prosperity, but about collective prosperity. And that's the foundation that Delbert's talking about real reconciliation sort of down the line. So let me shift a different question to Mark. And Mark, this question comes from Ruben. Do you see any serious downsides for Indigenous people or Indigenous nations from increased participation in the oil and gas industry? Do you see any significant downsides?
The downsides, First Nations are not going to accept every project that comes along from proponents on oil and gas. So there's going to be a lot of due diligence by First Nations, not just from the environmental side, but not just from the economic side, but also from the environmental side. Also, what's the longevity of these projects? So the downsides from these projects, I would say, would be probably, if there's going to be any, would be around the environmental, are there impacts of the degradation, which is why there is such high interest in First Nations in reviewing every aspect of a project. Is it going to damage the land? What's the long-term benefit to the community versus the impact of that project? What type of product is it? Is it gas? Is it oil? Is it electricity? Those are the questions that come up. The downside, I don't think First Nations are going to walk into a project that's going to damage the land or destroy the culture. That's something that's not going to happen. What you will see, though, is that you will see projects when they're embraced by First Nations as in our interests, then you will see an enthusiastic partner. I think you pointed out best too, the local growth of the entire region goes up simply because the certainty is involved. The second thing that comes up too is that First Nations, there was a Maori leader in New Zealand said it best. He says, we are the best projects. We're going to spend locally. We're not going anywhere. There's going to be no capital flight from here. All this money is going to be invested back right here. So, the idea of hollowing out the North by having Indigenous people involved in projects is nonsensical. It just doesn't happen. So that's my answer. I think the downside of it are the same that would happen to any community if they were looking at the environmental degradation questions. But if that's done properly and effectively and the community's on board, no, I don't see a large downside to it.
Thanks, Mark. One of the many things we put, we had both hands going up. So, Crystal, jump in.
I just wanted to add in terms of some of the challenges moving forward in when a project is successful. If you're a First Nations band that's used to managing what you get from the federal government, and then you transition into managing wealth, that is definitely a challenge for First Nations communities that are new to it. We definitely, this hasn't been, and I don't want to give the perception that, because we have a successful project in our territory, that everything is essentially a bed of roses. There are a ton of challenges that we're experiencing in terms of the growth and managing wealth. So I just wanted to add that to Mark's response.
Thanks, Crystal. Very much appreciate it. Delbert, you wanted to jump in too?
Yeah, no, I just some comments. And I guess the downside, back to your question is what I call the divide and conquer. You hear the stories, and I've heard them through my travels. Impact benefit agreements. You had it on the Line 3. You had it on different areas. How industry comes in, deals with this First Nation, goes to the next First Nation, goes to the next First Nation, and everybody's doing their darnest with the resources that they have. Sometimes very limited, sometimes nothing. Sometimes you have a good team that is able to put whatever you need together to get the best resolve at the end of the day. But why should we be put in that kind of a situation as First Nations? Why can't we why can't industry be fair about how they're dealing, and how they're going about, rather than you matter today because we need to get this across the line, and then you hear about First Nations that are in the same area being left out, right? So for me, it's like when you go back to the TMX as an example in 1953, we can only imagine how Indigenous peoples were treated in 1953 versus today. In 1953, it wasn't not too long ago where we had the right to vote, right? So it wasn't not too long ago where Canada as a whole recognized us as human beings. So here we are today. in 2020. So what would have been wrong, if TMX would have went back before, before this new pipeline extension or pipeline happened, to talk with the First Nations and say, hey, we know, what we did in 53. We don't want a repeat of that. Here's what it could be, and let's talk. Don't work it out. Don't plan it out, and then come back and negotiate IBAs and force a plan that you have no input in, right? So that's the downside that I talk about. True, meaningful participation, relationship, understanding, and education, so on and so forth. We wouldn't be going through what we're going through today, and there wouldn't be this. Are you for environment or are you for profit? Because the both, to me, go hand in hand, but it has to be done in a very understanding, responsible way. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent answers to that very great question. And one thing I'd offer on top of this, and Mark mentioned this really quickly, and it's inherent in both the Project Reconciliation and the Haisla Initiative with LNG Canada, is there's a really big issue here around longevity. That projects that have a long shelf life have a very different opportunity to contribute to stability and long-term prosperity. So if you look at Project Reconciliation and TransMoutain, you're not talking about a 2-year project or a 5-year project. You're talking about a 30, 40, 50, 60-year project with a lot of money coming into the communities over time. LNG Canada is not being built, so they can produce LNG, liquefied natural gas, for a couple of years. It's being built as a long-term sort of mega project to go on. I always use the example from Saskatchewan of Cameco, which has the world's largest concentration of uranium resources. And they're realizing their longevity. They've negotiated very long-term relationships with First Nations, and some very constructive ones. I also hasten to add, in the mining sector, we have very excellent relations with First Nations, but these are shorter-term projects. But we have more than 300 impact and benefit agreements between mining companies and Indigenous communities, and some very good, productive relationships that are framed by the fact that these may only be 7, 8, 9, 10-year projects, which is very, very different than planning something for the long term. Really, really excellent questions. So keeping things going and making sure you don't get any easy questions the entire time we're here. We have an excellent question here from Colleen. Many of our listeners will already know about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So Delbert, this question is to you. And the question really is, how will the introduction of Undrip legislation impact progress on resource partnerships? So we already have Undrip legislation in British Columbia. The government of Canada sort of introduced it, but then didn't pass it in the last parliament. They may reintroduce it and may pass it in the next parliament. But Delbert, how do you explain the potential role and impact of Undrip on these resource partnerships?
Well, I think it's first off, we know that Undrip it is an international document that affirms Indigenous human rights. Indigenous people must inform what Undrip should look like in Canada. No one else. It has articles that support Indigenous participation in every aspect, including economic life of the state. This is particularly noteworthy in the context of oil being Canada's most valuable export. I think what's important is that it calls for the government to work towards achieving consent and to sets out standards for the process of consultation. Undrip has changed little, for example, in BC since it was passed. And I think that some of the most important parts of Undrip seem to already be getting overlooked, like our right to self-determination, economic participation. It is much bigger than any project. And it is important for us to not let that be forgotten. So Undrip is a tool, is an instrument, international instrument that is there to help support and protect, the relationship that needs to exist between Indigenous peoples and whoever they're dealing with. So that's so I'm a strong supporter of Undrip. And I hope that we see the light of it.
Thank you. Well, we're seeing the light of it, but we haven't seen the full resolution. Mark.
Thank you. I just want to support Delbert's comment. Undrip will be defined by Indigenous people. It is an act that applies to us. Right now, we're seeing a lot of action from government lawyers coming in telling us what it means. And that's not the spirit of Undrip. The spirit of Undrip is the voice of Indigenous people in the development of the host state, which is what we are in Canada. So two things here, and very quickly, is that Undrip itself is coming up fast. First Nations are starting to orient around what those clauses mean. So the question around FPIC, which is Article 32, free, prior, informed consent. Looking at it from a practical point of view, if I was a industry in oil and gas or in pipelines, if you have an Indigenous partner who is a commercial partner, an equity partner in a project, it sort of removes the whole problem of, have we consulted with the First Nations adequately? Well, the First Nations are equity partners. They're now co-proponents. So in that sense, it provides more certainty than you'd get out of the current system, which is, have you consulted enough? What is adequate consultation? Is this deep consultation? No, that from a practical point of view solves that. Other articles in there, just Article 26, talking about the First Nations, our Indigenous rights to land development. Again, if a partner, if your co-proponent is part of your project, that can be taken care of very easily. So from a First Nations perspective, we think it adds certainty to the projects that are being proposed. The First Nations Major Projects Coalition just released a paper on how finance is going to be impacted by Undrip clauses. And that paper is on the website of the Major Projects Coalition, where we went through and said, okay, if we were looking at this development, this project from an Undrip lens, here's the clauses that would apply to the First Nations, and here are the clauses that would apply to the proponent, and actually map them out. So you're starting to see some First Nations starting to gather steam around it. Delbert's right, it's going to change a lot in how projects are done in this country. Not yet, but coming.
Yes, I like that, Mark. Not yet, but coming. And that's and in a positive way. Sometimes people see Undrip as a threat instead of an opportunity. And the interesting thing, when you look at those regions that have found a new path toward reconciliation, they're not stifled. I remember when the Nisga'a Treaty was signed in 1993 or something like that, when the Nisga'a Agreement came down, and people in Northwest Saskatchewan, Crystal, you were too young then to remember this, but when the Nisga'a Treaty was signed, a lot of people, not Aboriginal people in the area, said, oh, we'll never have development. We'll never cut a tree down. We'll have no mining. We're going to see everything's going to grind to a halt. And since it was signed, that area has actually been very robust. The Nisga'a have been very involved, exactly the way you say, Mark. They've been involved as partners, as collaborators. They've been involved as participants. Rather than seeing a collapse of economic activity, we've seen actual growth of economic activity, as in fact the Haisla have done with LNG Canada. And so it's kind of interesting watching in a sort of a 20-year period, and Undrip is part of this process of going from this idea that Indigenous people were opponents of resource development and going to stop it and deny prosperity to Canada as a whole, to the realization that the most prosperous parts of the country are those that actually have an integrated, positive, constructive relationship with Indigenous folks. And I point everybody's attentions to the far north and to look at the mining industry in Nunavut, where the mining industry in Nunavut have realized the importance of partnership. We've had very good relationships and very successful mines. So it's all it's not perfect. And I think all of you have sort of said that. But Crystal, let me ask you a question that came to us from Alex. So relating to your community, but also more broadly, how are you balancing impacts on the climate and the local environment with the opportunity for your communities to lead and participate in development projects? How do you weigh that development versus the environment balance?
That's definitely a great question, and one that would definitely make me shake a bit prior. But I think in terms of the environmental aspect, each of us, and I'm speaking from myself personally, here in my community, that we're so focused on what is happening within our territory and those boundaries and taking care of what is ours, as Mark alluded to in a prior comment, our land is who we are. It's our identity. It's our culture. So we're definitely, as myself as a Haisla woman, definitely concerned when it comes to the boundaries of our territory, what is here, what's impacting. But the bigger picture is our global impacts and how we are addressing it from that perspective. You know, what happens in India or Asia impacts our salmon here within our territorial boundaries. So in terms of that concept, I believe with LNG Canada, we are assisting in that context. So it is eventually is going to be in the best interest of my grandson's future. I think I just wanted to add in terms of that conversation around the balancing portion as well. When I talk about salmon in our rivers and having to work with other government regulators, you know, the priority of some governments isn't the priority, not necessarily of our community. And I just want to use our Ulukan as an example. So our Ulukan, our community has been known along the coast for our Ulukan and the grease that we make from it. And throughout the years of development in our territory, we've seen a huge decline, dramatic decline of that stock in our territory. And it's a huge staple in our culture. It's a huge focus and a huge priority. Through the development of the projects in our territory, we've been able to bring light to that priority and that focus of revitalizing those stocks within our territories through work with LNG Canada and other proponents, that our nation essentially has the capacity and the revenues to put our priorities into revitalizing those stocks within our area. So there are other opportunities when it comes to our focuses, our cultural ties, and the importance of those in our environment and our territory.
Thank you very much. That's a really important and valuable sort of comment. Delbert, I'm going to switch gears a little bit on you, and this one here, the question comes from Jewel. How do First Nations feel about other types of energy in addition to oil and gas? Are they interested in investing in wind farms, offshore wind, or setting aside land to sell carbon credits? Over to you, Delbert.
I think, you know, we're very interested, you know, but at the same time, we're very cautious. You know, you hear the arguments that are going back and forth, you know, on wind, you know, on solar paneling. Everybody is moving that. A lot of people are moving that way. There's been a lot of positive development in that in First Nations, Indigenous communities. You know, and it's great. But you also got to consider the environmental impact, you know, that they may carry as well. You know, they talk about, you know, solar paneling, that this is what it is. Wind energy, this is what it does. You know, so all that is what I know many communities are considering, and some are, you know, some are left with realities that we, you know, where we live, as an example, we don't have the wind, you know, to have the to really take full advantage of it. And, you know, but we are open, and many Indigenous communities are open. But do we have the means? You know, do we have the means to get involved? And this is where, you know, through the Sovereign Wealth Fund of what we always put forward as project reconciliation, is that the Sovereign Wealth Fund, you know, through, you know, as an example with the TMX, you know, which is a means to an end. It's not. It's a leverage. It's a springboard to something, you know, even better and greater. And using that as a springboard, you know, to realize opportunities that we wouldn't otherwise be able to get involved in. You have, for example, uranium, that small nuclear reactors that the province of Saskatchewan is talking about, and you have other provinces that are signing on in support of that. So the question, the dialogue needs to happen among Indigenous groups is that, what do we think about that? What should our play be in that? And other resources, right? But it always comes back to the question, well, do we have the money? How can we get involved? And so we see a lot of these developments that are happening in our backyard, and no means of getting involved, or getting the a small percentage of inclusion. Okay, we're going to bring you in, at this percentage point. When if we had the means, we could be in as a major partner or a majority owner or owning it, right? And so here's where we. I always say that as Indigenous peoples, many times we see development happening from our window on a reserve, and then we look behind and we see poverty behind us. And so how do we get involved without saying, well, we did involve you, but you didn't step up? Well, we don't have the means. So yeah, I think that Indigenous peoples are open for business, but it goes back to Mark's point. We're not going to dump that everything.
And it's interesting, Mark, I'll come to you in 1 second. Just a quick observation on what you said, Delbert, that what you described for First Nations is actually the model for Canada. We are a resource-dependent economy, done very, very well with forestry, with fishing, with mining, with oil and gas and things of that sort, which we have used as the foundation for other kinds of prosperity. Our cities are some of the best cities we have 4 cities in Canada in the top 20 cities, ranked cities in the world. We have wonderful universities. We have all sorts of innovation investments. Those come from the oil and gas sector. They come from the mining sector and the forestry sector. And what you're essentially saying is you want to take the project reconciliation model is to take the experience of Canada as a whole and make it work for First Nations. Excellent. Thank you very much. Mark, over to you.
The question was on green energy. Would First Nations be interested? Yes, by all means. It's not as simple, though, as just building a green energy facility. Wind power, electricity, depends on the province you're in. You then fall into not just federal policy, but provincial policies around utilities, around access to transmission lines. Here in British Columbia, we have a crown utility, BC Hydro, and there's a policy called wheeling, which is basically moving the electricity, the electrons from one place to another through the transmission grid. We're prevented from doing that. Or if we do it, it's at a cost that is beneficial to hydro. We can only sell the power to them at the cost that it costs them to produce power off a major hydroelectric facility that's been paid off for years by the state. So it's not effective. So there are many cases where green power options have opened up. We do not usually, because our communities are so small, have the ability to use enough power from the facility. Also, we're looking to do these things as revenue generations for other economic purposes that Crystal pointed out. So again, the Major Projects Coalition, 2 papers we did on electrical infrastructure. We did look at those green energy options. What was fascinating is that they are happening in different places in the country. They are happening in British Columbia too, but they're very small and very specific. So it's not just the First Nations who can't get involved. Sometimes it's provincial policies, the electrical utility policies, the capital problems. One thing that was fascinating when we were doing our research is we reached out to American tribes to see how they ran some of their utilities, because they do have power generation facility or utilities in the United States. And as soon as we reached out, we had an American tribe just fascinated because they can sell green power at a premium in their market because of the way they're set up. And they immediately wanted to set up a joint venture with First Nations in BC where they would buy our green power. They could sell at a premium into California or Nevada, Colorado. But there's no way we can get that power to the border because we have to go through BC Hydro, and BC Hydro's policies block us from doing that. So there's all sorts of barriers. It's not just the First Nations, and it's not just the federal government. There's all sorts of pieces that have to be worked out. As First Nations people, leaders in our fields, we have to be experts in public policy, finance policy, First Nations politics, commercial transactions. It adds up. So please be aware that we are aware of these opportunities and we're doing our best to get them, but there's a lot of hills to climb.
Thanks, Mark. That's a really important corrective, and I really appreciate you calling attention again to the size of the communities and the capacity to respond. It's clear that you're seeing situations with, the project reconciliation.
Actually, Brett just has to reconnect it.
Streaming is on.
Delbert, please jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, it's always I always get excited when I hear Mark talk about his experience and bringing to light the realities of what we're up against, and sometimes it's a lot of it is good challenges, but from the project reconciliation side, when it looks at the sovereign wealth, the most important thing I think about the sovereign wealth of what we propose is the ability to have the capital monies to get involved in invest in economic development opportunities. But more importantly, it's the ability to diversify, the investments, so, and we know what happens when you're diversifying your investments, support the other, or they're all going at, all firing at the same. And so that's what's important. And the other point is that as far back as I can remember, and I'm a very young man, Ken, you know that, we've always been an energy dependent community, country, and everything, and so so we have to acknowledge that, we have to respect that, but it doesn't mean that we can make the changes that are required to have a responsible nation, and our people have done that. They've been living responsibly, with the environment, in tune with the environment. So I just want to mention that. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Down to the last question. I wish we could go on much longer, but I think you folks have all been quite wonderful. So, Crystal, let me ask a question that, again, one of our audience members asked, and it was Jen who asked this. Are Indigenous communities becoming more vulnerable to rising inequality? If so, does Canada have an urgent moral imperative to ensure that resource wealth is used to address these long-standing issues?
Sorry about that. My computer froze and I couldn't unmute myself there for a bit. I think that comes with the challenges that we're looking to face. When we first started down this road to improve the quality of lives of our members, we're fortunate that LNG Canada isn't the first major opportunity that our members have experienced. We were participant to Rio Tinto's modernization of their aluminum smelter here in our territory. So I believe the construction for that was about 3 to 4 years. So our members had an opportunity to experience the wealth that was generated for jobs throughout that project. At the time, there was missed opportunity in developing the career aspect. Our members, I believe, some of them were essentially examples of what not to do and what to do. So building off of that success and seeing some of the social issues that we were witness to during that time period, we've been able to work with other organizations within our region to start focusing in on some of those impacts, whether they be negative or positive. So we've established partnerships with the Tamatic Status of Women. We're developing relationships with our Northern Health here in our community. So it's being able to stretch our capacity, but to pick up and develop those very important relationships where we see that we don't have the capacity to be able to do that, not only with our communities locally that we've been able to establish those relationships with, but I had stated earlier that building relationships with other First Nations communities in our area I sit on as a co-chair with the chief counselor of Kitamat of an alliance group that is specifically focused on the social issues of our people, and it is the LNG Canada project that essentially brought us all together. And at that table, we focus on the mental health aspect of our people. It is very difficult to get some professionals specifically in the mental health. We've been looking for a drug and alcohol counselor for, I think, as long as I've been on council, and that's, I think it's seven and a half years. And we haven't been able to fill those positions. So discussions at that table are, how do we utilize our relationships to benefit our people? So where do we share resources? If they have a project that's successful, say in housing, we're able to use their template to be able to have those types of projects in each of our territories, and we support one another. Terrace is a central location to all of our communities, and a huge focus is housing. So we pool our resources to be able to address the housing issues, say in Terrace, where it'll be geared towards all of our people. I think in the previous question that was for me, I'd failed to, and I apologize to my the table that I sit on with the First Nations Climate Initiative. And that's another table that I sit with leaders from Metlakatla, Port Simpson, and Nisga'a, where our 4 communities have come together to discuss issues that are climate related, and how First Nations can participate within policy development around energy projects, specifically LNG. We see that our LNG, we're fortunate here in BC for all of the reserves that we do have, and First Nations participating within that aspect to prosper as well. So I apologize to the other communities that I work with on that table, but I needed to mention our work that we're doing at that level as well.
Crystal, thank you very, very much. I'm afraid we've run sort of out of time. And I must say, we've had 3 absolutely wonderful presenters. I'm going to give you each about 30 to 45 seconds to sort of make a final comment. So Delbert, you can integrate your thoughts into that if you like. We've had a wonderful conversation. I must say, every time I talk to the 3 of you and many of your colleagues, that I just admire your optimism, your practicalities. You know the problems. You know these are not easy things to do. The visions that you share are absolutely outstanding, and the passion you have for working with communities. You are their strength. The kind of leaders that we have in the 3 of you and others are absolutely essential. So I'm going to give each person here a chance to sort of have their 35 to 45 seconds of a final wrap up, and we'll start with Mark if we could.
Speaking to a non-Indigenous audience, I would say, apologies to Douglas Adams, don't panic. It's all going to be okay. First Nations being involved in major infrastructure of this country will only strengthen the country, the economy, the entire nation. First Nations are not against development. We're in favor of smart development that matches the local needs, economic, environmental, of the nations. So Canada is a great country, and this will only make it stronger.
Thanks so much, Mark. Delbert, we'll go to you next.
Thank you very much, Ken. For me, poverty is our number one enemy, and we have to defeat this collectively. And the only way we can do that is for Indigenous peoples, is for us as leaders to create the opportunity and a way out of that in partnership with Canada. And we cannot be afraid, to take that step as Indigenous leaders, but carefully and responsibly to enhance the abilities that we have. And that's what Project Reconciliation is about. I believe that we are stronger together. and we will move together in that light. So with that, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Albert. Krista, we're going to leave the last word to you here.
Thank you. I think your comments around big projects and often missing the opportunity to think about people. As I stated earlier, a lot of my motivation for all the, and Mark alluded to in his comments around being versed in First Nations politics, it's a long list that us leaders definitely have to delve into. And it is a lot of weight on our shoulders in terms of that well-being of our community and balancing that. It's a lot of sleepless nights. And if you could see, if my camera's got high resolution, you can see all the gray hair that I have now. But it's those examples of the success stories. We want to be part of the economy. We want to improve the quality of the lives of our people. We want the same standard when it comes to other parts of Canada, when it comes to our people. For far too long, we've been sitting on the sidelines, watching the development, watching the success. Rio Tinto has been across the channel for 50, 60 years, and we've never had real participation. And now this opportunity is in front of all of us. And the prime focus for me personally is the success of individuals. We want an independent nation as we were prior. And in order to get that, we need independent members. And to push for that, to remove all barriers and to provide that opportunity of success is, like I had stated earlier, there's no other word that I have to describe for it other than it moves me emotionally. It gets me out of bed every day to focus on what we need to do here as leaders to be a part of this. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to everybody that tuned in this morning. I think it's time for me to go take a nap.
Crystal, thank you very much. And let me join in thanking the audience for being with us today. And I'm sure the audience members are going to be thanking you. I've been getting a whole bunch of emails from friends and colleagues who are sort of on the thing talking about what a wonderful session this has been and how much informative it has been. Folks, this is a Macdonald-Laurier webinar on Indigenous well-being, arising and prosperity, arising out of their participation in the oil and gas sector. We've been joined this morning by Mark Panelists, who is the Director of Economic Policy and Initiatives for the First Nations Major Project Coalition, by Crystal Smith, who's Chief Counselor for the Haisla National Nation Council, and Delbert Wapas, who's the founder of Project Reconciliation and former Chief of the Thunderchild First Nation. Thanks to all three of you. You were magnificent as always. Thanks for sharing your passion and your sense of urgency. And your belief in the link between these great projects and the lives of tens of thousands of individual First Nations people. Canada owes First Nations people a better future. First Nations people are going to get there not by charity, not by acts of paternalism by government and by the population as a large, but by finally being re-empowered, re-liberated, given the opportunity to sort of play an economic role in the country. With the three of you and many others sort of leading the way, I can see a much better future. Thank you very much on behalf of Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I thank all of you for joining us this morning.